You're watching IntoWineTV, and today we're filming from Sonoma, and we're talking about the differences between New World versus Old World. And Richard, can you explain that? What is the difference?
Well, I think I can. I think most writers and people who use the term Old World versus New World wine are using it in the same sense that historians have written about colonialism. The Old World is definitely Europe and Eastern Europe and probably Russia. It gets to be a gray area as to whether or not Asia or parts of Asia are included. In terms of wine, certainly I think the focus is even a little more on what are the areas that have been making wine continuously since, at least the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages. Those would be the great winemaking regions of Europe, like Burgundy. I think Eastern Europe belongs in that area too. There are a lot of claims for where grapes were first domesticated and where winemaking first started. But the New World would then be the regions that have a much younger winemaking tradition. It was the colonists who brought Vitis vinifera grapes, which are the ones that are required to make wine as we know it, to the New World, to the Americas, to Australia. South Africa got it pretty early on. I almost sometimes count South Africa more in the Old World in terms of traditions, and that they have a 2 or 3 century tradition of winemaking, but probably most people count them in the New World.
And also it was really related to the Old World kind of had more different, less technological innovations that were used. Certainly, you come to California or the United States and there was a lot of more different innovations. As a wine writer, I prefer not to use terms Old World and New World because I think a lot of people who are maybe new to wine go, I don't know, what is that supposed to mean? And I think it's a point of confusion because it is kind of a vague thing. It can mean the physical geography, it can mean technological innovations, it can mean a lot of different things, but these days to me there is no Old World and New World. There are wines coming from regions all over the place, some of which use modern technological innovations in terms of specific winemaking and some that don't.
Well, I think nowadays it's actually, there are several definitions of New World, Old World, but I also classify Argentina and Chile as Old World and South Africa certainly as Old World because they've been making wines for hundreds of years. So it's really difficult to define what is a New World. Certainly New Zealand is New World, that's been making wine for about 30 years, and Australia is relatively new, although they've been making wine for 200 years. I think today it's more of a style than anything. What is a New World wine, what is an Old World wine? New World wines are stylistically are the bigger, more upfront, fruity, sweeter, versus the Old World sort of more subtle, more subdued.
I find international style to be a better descriptor for those kinds of wines. Wines that are made from international varieties like Chardonnay and Cabernet and Merlot and Syrah, as opposed to some of the indigenous varieties.
But what are you saying international style is? Are you saying international style? How are you defining that?
That they tend to be what we associate with more modern winemaking, not the traditions. It's not terroir based.
You see, I don't call that an international style at all. I would define Old World wines as international style because they're recognized as great wines all around the world, whereas the upfront big fruit wines, which are New World styles, are not internationally recognized as great wines. They're very popular in America.
Yeah, but there's
not in England.
A lot of, well, it's not just England though, but there's a lot of countries. I disagree with that. I think number one, I would get rid of the definition because it's just one more way to confuse a wine buying public. What is old, what is new? What do I buy for, I'm having chicken for dinner, what do I get, an Old World wine? It just becomes this kind of thing. And I think unfortunately a lot of our industry is built on this system, this matrix of verbiage to keep people out. And I think that's a bad thing. I do think that a lot of California wines are recognized as world class. So I disagree with you on that point.
Oh no, I'm not saying that California wines are not recognized as world class. I'm saying that the New World style of California wines are, but there are plenty of, like Inman. Inman's a great Pinot Noir producer, but she's making an old world style of Pinot Noir right here in Sonoma, Russian River.
What would be some of the characteristics of that Old World style?
More elegant, less high alcohol, less sweet, drier, as opposed to the much bigger Pinot Noirs from Oregon and Washington, which are much more. I would say those are New World wines, whereas Inman is an Old World wine.
For me, part of the Old World, when you use that term, you're getting into the history of it, the fact that there were decades, centuries of studying the land in places like Burgundy and figuring out what grapes go best where, with what exposures, when they should be picked. I mean, in the old world, as I think of it, people really have figured out what goes best where. In the new world, places that have only been growing wine grapes for the last several decades, there's not that experience. They're still trying things out. And a lot of the wines can taste the same. It's hard to get a real sense of place like you can in old world wines, where they've developed these traditions. Even if the tradition is blended wine, there's more of a distinct sense of terroir of that particular region than you find when they do the same blends in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so just going back on my theory, I mean, you can get old world and new world wines produced in Bordeaux.
Yes, absolutely.
Even though it's an old world, if you're talking geographically about, it's an old world producing area.
But I guess my frustration with that, and I agree with you, is the fact that when we say old world, we're referring to wines that are maybe a little more elegant, a little more finesse, less alcohol, less, more dry. But that still creates this kind of classification.
I agree.
And I would want people to buy a wine from Paso Robles if it's made in a really bold, aggressive style or a very restrained style, and buy it because they want this, as opposed to, well, now this is defined as old school or old world or new world. And I understand why those definitions are there, but again, I find it to be frustrating because it's one more layer of education you have to go through.
Yeah, maybe, but it's not a judgment on quality. If you say old world, new world, referring to one more fruit-forward wine versus more subtle wine, it's just, I find it useful because an old world style is a good way of explaining that it's going to be not a massive fruit bomb.
But I do disagree with that in the sense that I think a lot of global wine writers, they use old world as a compliment, and new world is a little bit of an insult because they are these big, aggressive, bold, kind of brash wines.
Possibly, but if you look at a country like Argentina, Bodegas Weinert, which Robert Parker actually wrote of there 77 years ago, that it was the best wine from South America, as good as any great wine in the world. And today, Robert Parker loves a very different style of wine from Argentina. I don't know what he thinks of Weinert anymore, but certainly But Weinert makes an old style wine, old world style of wine. Catena, for instance, the complete opposite end of the spectrum, makes a very new world style of wine, and they're 20 miles from each other.
And I think for me, I do still find the terms old world and new world useful in some ways, but from what you were just describing, Bartholomew, I'm thinking the term traditional style winemaking.
Maybe that's certainly a good way of putting it, but it does, people do use old world and new world for that reason.
But even again, if they are fundamentally stylistic differences, we should be talking about that as opposed to one more label to slap on something. And I do see when I travel around the globe and I see people talk about old world wines, it's because they have a fondness for all the great wines are from Bordeaux and all these old blah 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 blah, as opposed to this style is more restrained, this style is more bold. I think we can use verbiage that is less, not inflammatory, that's the wrong word, but I think a lot of the verbiage we use, there are these hidden insults. When people, Paso Robles I think is a great example, a lot of the wines coming out of there are big, bold wines. They're not necessarily finessed with much, a lot of renegade winemakers there. So a lot of people would say, oh, that's New World. And there's a subtle insult in that because it doesn't have the elegance of Burgundy or Bordeaux or these kind of things that we have this idea entrenched in our mind that old world is better.
Unless you like those kind of wines.
Unless you like those kind of wines.
Then it's not an insult at all.
Whether it's old world or new world, whatever types you like, I'm sure that those terms won't be going away anytime soon. We'll continue to see them, and we hope you'll continue to watch the show as we talk some more about various wine topics. And thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next time.